Advent begins in the dark. And in this dark landscape, we are invited to describe life on earth as it is, to name the seeming absence of God. We sit in darkness, longing for light. We sit in exile, longing for home. In Advent, our desire for God strains towards God's desire for us. Advent reminds us that necessary things happen in the dark. Next spring's seeds break open in dark winter soil. God's Spirit hovers over the waters in the dark, preparing to create worlds. The child we wait for grows in the deep darkness of the womb. As Barbara Brown Taylor puts it, we're called to trust that darkness does not come from a different place than light. It's not presided over by a different God. What often looks to be the end of the world as we know it is actually the birth pangs of something new being born. Only days before Jesus is handed over to be crucified, he insists, "Now when these things begin to take place, stand up and raise your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." In the west of Ireland, there's a rugged landscape called the Burren. Some of the landscape has been carved out of softer rock, as you see this incredible view from the cliffs of Moher. And further south, there's a far western island called Skellig Michael, which might remind you of Star Wars, because it was on this island that they filmed the planet Ahch-To in The Last Jedi, the place where Luke Skywalker had been living. But much of the Burren is barren rock. It's a limestone pavement which was formed deep under the waters of an ancient tropical sea. Eventually, this landmass rose up from the sea bottom and broke away from its home near the equator until it bumped into some other islands and became part of the island. Later, glaciers came, covering the pavement in a thick layer of ice and snow. The movement of the glaciers left crisscrossing cracks known as grikes. John O'Donohue, the late Irish mystic and poet, writes, "You can imagine when the first trickles of water began to loosen and the glaciers began to move and the landscape became freed of this whole darkness on top of it. The first time that the sun touched it and seeds, maybe hidden for thousands of years, began to awaken in the earth." O'Donohue said, so landscape has the memory of the time of ice that the human knows nothing about, except, he believes, that we are made out of clay, and so in some sense that memory is in our clay as well. Maybe, O'Donohue wonders, that's the reason that fear can get to us so quickly. Fear awakens this relic cold in the bone again. But in this limestone pavement of the Burren, deep in the fissures of the rock, in the grikes, are seeds of tropical plants that grow near the equator. And because of the year-round moderate temperatures and the protection of the grikes, these tropical flowers, like this orchid, still bloom every spring in the Burren. We see only the surface of this landscape, but hidden in the darkness are the ancient seeds buried in a distant past. Their awakening startles us. Their blooming unexpected, an interruption into the way we are sure life is always going to be. The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will fulfill the promise I made to the house of Israel. I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land. In Advent, We're not waiting for something which is going to happen. Rather, we're beginning to be swept up into the rejoicing which is coming forth from what has already happened. We're invited to remember and dream an ancient dream. Be alert and on guard so that your hearts are not weighed down by the worries of this life. In the present landscape, our fear of the outsiders has taken shape in a desire to build a wall to keep others out. But our fear has instead imprisoned us inside our own hearts as we cry out, "There is no room in the inn." A voice interrupts this settled reality. Do not be afraid, for see, I bring you good news of great joy. This Advent, we began again with our annual St. Nicholas Day. About 600 volunteers became messengers of hope, interrupting the settled reality of the world as it is, putting flesh on God's promise. Whatever we did yesterday was just a small thing, inviting our neighbors to share food for the hungry and the stranger, gathering what was left behind, a forgotten harvest, bounty for another's table, inviting the homeless in to share a meal, visiting the sick and the elderly, singing out God's promise of comfort and joy. Like the branch that springs from the stump of David, our actions on St. Nicholas Day are pregnant with promise and possibilities. Like seed buried in the clay, we hold deep the memory of God's promise, waiting to take flesh in us. In the words St. Paul spoke to the Thessalonians, "Beloved, may the Lord make you increase and abound in love for one another and for all."